Christianity is coming back into public schools, and we need to talk about it. All right, are you ready for more? I wish there wasn't more, but sadly there is. So let's move over to the state of Idaho. Remember the 1963 Supreme Court case that deemed it unconstitutional to read the Bible in public schools? Well, because of that court case decision, a similar law about reading the Bible in public schools in Idaho was struck down. However, after the 2022 Coach Kennedy case, that law about reading the Bible has resurfaced. And it is now the Idaho Bill 162. If you remember, the Supreme Court decided with the Coach Kennedy case that decisions about the Establishment Clause had to be made with a historical perspective. And that's exactly what Idaho legislators are really digging into with this new bill. It was presented in February 2025, and it starts off with some interesting points. Let's take a look. It says, the Bible is the most important book in the world, molds public morality, impacts history, and contains unequaled literary value. Wow, that's a lot of claims. First, importance is subjective. So the claim that the Bible is the most important book can't be proven. Also, saying that it is the most important book in the world is simply hyperbolous. You can't tell me that it's the most important book in East Asia or the Middle East. That's just simply not true. Heck, a lot of people here in the United States would not agree with that, like me. Moving on to molds public morality. Now, this is an interesting point that I don't want to get into too much detail in this video because it's quite complex and I think it deserves a whole video of its own. But I do want to point out that a lot of the moral ideas in the Bible, especially those expressed by Jesus, were not new ideas. Take the Golden Rule, for example. That was established well before Jesus, but a lot of people contributed to the Bible and Christianity because it's a popular book, but it wasn't created by Jesus. So that idea of the Golden Rule, do unto others as you would have them do to you, that molds morality, right? But that isn't necessarily from the Bible. It is in the Bible, yes, but the Bible didn't invent it. Jesus didn't invent it. So I could argue that it isn't actually the Bible impacting public morality in that point, but philosophers and religions before Jesus. So this whole idea of the Bible molding public morality, has the Bible impacted morality? Yes, but I don't think it has to the extent that people really believe it has. Moving on to the phrase impact history. I mean, yes, obviously the Bible has impacted history. The question is for better or for worse, right? And finally, the phrase unequaled literary value. I mean, this is also extremely subjective, right? I know a lot of people who would value a dozen other books well before the Bible. Even historians who value biblical texts would also value non-biblical texts equally, right? The Bible, just because it's the Bible, it doesn't have more literary value than others. And so this phrase unequal literary value is just insane to me. Now, the next section in the introduction of this Idaho bill explains the importance and the impact of specifically the King James Version of the Bible. Now, I think that's very interesting because you would assume that the King James Version is the first English version, and that's why it's so important, right? But it wasn't actually the first English translation. The reason that the King James Version became so popular was because of King James. King James of England wanted to make a version of his own of the Bible. Okay, so he commissioned a superior version to be made, and that was what he supported and dispersed. And so that was what became popular. So in fact, from the beginning, it wasn't necessarily the King James Version of the Bible that had such an impact. It was the ruling party behind it. It was the monarchy supporting and implementing it and saying that this is the superior version. And what's interesting to me is that the original settlers of the United States, many of them at least, came to this country to escape the religious government and to escape such tyranny that implemented a specific version of Christianity, and they sought religious freedom. And now their ancestors, people today, are returning to that. And I think it's just very ironic that we are going back in the past. We are backpedaling yet again. Now, the next two sections of this Idaho bill explains the importance of the Bible for early Americans. And I just have to say, so what? Who cares? That was, what, 250 years ago? I don't really care if early Americans thought the Bible was important. The society is completely different today. So I don't really know. But since the Supreme Court in 2022 with the Coach Kennedy case decided that we're looking at everything with a historical perspective, it's now important again what the original Americans thought, which is just ridiculous to me. But this is the argument that legislators are using, and it is very clear in this specific bill in Idaho. From there, we have a list of Supreme Court cases, many of which we have discussed in this video. Point 13 then specifically calls out the shift in the Establishment Clause jurisprudence, or in simple terms, the philosophy of how we interpret the Establishment Clause. And this again refers to the result of the Coach Kennedy case, how we are now supposedly using a historical lens to determine what violates the Establishment Clause and what doesn't. So legislators in this act are arguing that decisions on cases like Abington versus Schempp are no longer valid. And so that makes Bible reading constitutional because we're now interpreting the Constitution with a historical lens. And since the original Americans and the original settlers read the Bible in schools, well, so should we today. That's the argument they're going with. And obviously I have so many issues with this, right? My main issue is that the Supreme Court should not use a historical lens to interpret the Constitution. The United States is nothing like it was when it was founded. Again, that was about 250 years ago. And so we cannot use societal norms from 250 years ago to define our societal norms today. Simple as that. We have made amendments to the Constitution for a reason. Things change. Views change. Amendments have been added to give more rights to people. Why are we now looking at things in a historical sense of what people 250 years ago did? Why are we not considering, I don't know, maybe an amendment to really explain what the Establishment Clause is? I don't get why we can't add something to the Constitution, like an amendment to further clarify that instead of saying, no, we have to go back and look back at 250 years ago, what people then did. And since they did it back then we have to do it now. I think that is just ridiculous. And besides that obvious glaring issue, the Establishment Clause clearly states that the government should not elevate one religion over another, and Bible reading in schools using government funds, might I add, is clearly unconstitutional. And here's another interesting tidbit of information. So I was talking to my husband about this topic and this video, and we had just studied for the U.S. citizenship exam, which is 100 civics questions. And when I mentioned this topic and how religion is coming back into public schools, he actually quoted to me one of the questions from the U.S. citizenship civics exam. And that question is, what is freedom of religion? And he quoted to me, you can practice a religion or not practice a religion. So if immigrants coming to this country must memorize those questions and answers and already have an understanding that there is no official religion in this country, there is pure freedom of religion. If immigrants understand that concept, why do legislators not? Right? I don't care if the people who founded this country and settled in this country were generally religious. They didn't want one religion elevated over another, and that's why the Establishment Clause was written. Where is that discussion in this supposedly historical way of viewing the Constitution? Why are we not discussing why the Establishment Clause was written? Why are we not discussing the fact that religious people supported it and supported this separation of church and state, even though it didn't use those exact words? That was Jefferson. But where's this discussion when we're looking at the Constitution with a historical lens? Why is this not included in that historical discussion? I can't quite fathom how highly educated people, these legislators that are writing these acts, even got to this point. I don't understand how they processed this information, how they thought this through, and how they ignored such critical elements of history. I can't understand how they're interpreting the Supreme Court cases so differently now. I'm really struggling to understand how we got to this point. But so that was a lot of historical context before the actual proposed law. So let's look at the title here in this Idaho bill. It is school-sponsored Bible reading. I mean, just the title alone shows how unconstitutional it is. Remember that government funds shouldn't go towards supporting one religion or another or non-religion in a public school. Well, the title alone says school-sponsored Bible reading. That's very clear that the school is sponsoring or funding Bible reading in public schools. This is like overturning all of the aforementioned Supreme Court cases that we talked about. And obviously, as we just looked at, legislators believe that the Coach Kennedy case overturned those Supreme Court cases, those previous decisions. I don't know if they actually have overturned those decisions, but I would argue that no, the Establishment Clause is very clear. You cannot make any law specifically supporting one religion or non-religion over another. So the Establishment Clause hasn't changed. I don't understand how they could even argue that this is constitutional, even with the Coach Kennedy case. Now, the actual law states that if approved, selections from 3 approved versions will be read each morning in all public schools so that the entire Bible is read sequentially over a period of 10 years. Okay, but wait. The good news is that there will be no comments or interpretations on the readings. How few. Oh, and also students and teachers can opt out if they so choose. But if a teacher opts out, then they'll just get a new teacher to replace them. So the students will still be listening to Bible reading. It's insane, guys. And this act finishes up with a note about how a parent, employee, or even a district resident can essentially snitch on a school if they're not implementing these Bible readings. So think about this. If someone in a school district who doesn't have a student in the public school system, but just some random person in the school district, they find out that the school is not including the Bible readings because the school, I don't know, maybe they decided that this was unconstitutional, like it is. So perhaps the school principal or the superintendent decided, you know what, we're not going to do that. Let's not say anything. We're just not going to do it. If someone in the school district finds out about it, they can go to the authorities and report the school. And then the law has to come in and force the school to implement these Bible readings. This is insane, guys. Craziness. Utter craziness. I want to point out that I found this news on the Idaho Freedom page, which is a conservative advocacy group. It interestingly pointed out that the act is not unconstitutional. In other words, it is constitutional based on a historical interpretation, like we talked about. But it does say that this act violates Article 9, Section 6 of the state's constitution, which says no sectarian or religious tenets or doctrines shall ever be taught in the public schools, and no books, papers, tracts, or documents of a political, sectarian, or denominational character shall be used or introduced in any schools. So that's very interesting. It violates the state constitution, but not the national, not the country's constitution. It's pretty interesting. So the act, from what I can see, the act attempts to skirt around the state constitution with a part about no comment or interpretation, so you're not teaching about the Bible. But the act is still proposing an introduction of the Bible in public schools, which would violate the state constitution. So because it violates the state constitution, hopefully it won't pass. But it is worrisome to me how the legislators are including the historical context and saying that because of the Coach Kennedy case, all of the previous Supreme Court decisions are essentially overturned, and that the Establishment Clause is now interpreted in a completely different manner, and that Bible reading is constitutional. So that's what is most worrisome to me. I don't think that this will pass because it is unconstitutional according to the state constitution, but the idea itself is worrisome. This video looks at one state's legislation regarding education and religion. If you want to watch the whole video about how Christianity is coming back into public schools, check out the link in the description below.